I stood in my kitchen in Queen Anne, watching the mist crawl over the Space Needle like a slow, grey ghost. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, a bitter sludge that matched the metallic taste in my mouth. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, the time I usually spent cataloguing the silence of my house. But today the silence was heavy. It felt like it was pressing against my ribs, making it hard to take a full breath. The radiator hissed in the corner, a rhythmic, lonely sound that had become my only companion since I retired from the library. I had spent 40 years among the hushed whispers of books, organizing the stories of others, but I never realized how terrifying it was when your own story simply stopped. The phone sat on the granite countertop, glowing with a persistent, mocking light. I had been staring at Tyler's name on the screen for 3 minutes before I found the strength to swipe. My fingers were trembling and I hated myself for it. Why should a mother tremble when her only son calls? "Hello, Tyler," I said. My voice sounded thin, like old parchment that might tear if I spoke too loudly. "Hi, Mum," he said. There was a background noise on his end, a soft, expensive clinking of silverware, and the low hum of a jazz trio. It sounded like wealth. It sounded like a world I had never been invited to visit. "Look, I'm calling because I wanted to tell you personally before you saw it on social media. We did it. We got married yesterday at the estate by Lake Washington." The air left my lungs in a sharp, quiet huff. Yesterday. The word felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I looked at the small calendar on my wall where I had circled his wedding date for months, a date he had told me was still being decided. I had bought a dress, a simple navy silk that I thought wouldn't embarrass him. It was still hanging in my closet, shrouded in plastic, a shroud for a ghost that would never walk. "You got married?" I whispered. "Yesterday." Tyler cleared his throat. I could hear the hesitation, the calculated coldness he had learned from Chloe and her family. "We decided to keep it intimate, Mum. The Montgomerys, well, they had a very specific vision for the event. They wanted a certain atmosphere, high-end, cohesive, you know? They felt that having too many guests from different backgrounds would disrupt the flow. Chloe's parents were just more worthy of being in that circle for the ceremony. They understand the nuances of these things. It was a private ceremony for the people who truly fit the aesthetic. Worthy. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my kitchen. I thought of the 30 years I spent working double shifts at the University of Washington Library so he could go to the best schools. I thought of the winters I wore the same threadbare coat so he could have the latest sneakers, the newest laptop, the life of a boy who never knew the taste of poverty. I thought of the night his father died of a heart attack in this very kitchen, and how I held Tyler for 12 hours straight, promising him that I would be his anchor, that he would never be alone. I had been worthy enough to pay for his life, but I wasn't worthy enough to see him start a new one. "I see," I said. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, numbing sensation that started in my marrow and worked its way out. "You didn't think I would fit the aesthetic?" "It's not like that, Mum," he said, his voice rising with a familiar, defensive irritation. "Don't make this a drama." It was a logistical decision. We're going to have a small brunch for the extended relatives later this summer. You'll be invited to that. It'll be more your speed, less pressure. A small brunch. The leftovers of his affection. I looked at my hands, the skin spotted with age, the nails short and practical. These were the hands that had scrubbed his floors, that had turned the pages of 1,000 bedtime stories, that had meticulously saved every penny into a trust fund that he had drained the moment he turned 25. "Is Chloe happy?" I asked. I didn't know why I cared. Maybe it was just the librarian in me, wanting to make sure the ending was at least orderly. "She's glowing," Tyler said, and I could hear the genuine adoration in his voice, the kind he used to reserve for me when he was 10 years old. "But look, Mum, there's another reason I'm calling. The wedding was spectacular, but there was a bit of a snag with the financing. The Montgomerys, they had some issues with their liquid assets at the last minute. Some offshore accounts were frozen for a routine audit. It's nothing serious, just a timing thing." I closed my eyes. I knew what was coming. It was a script I had read too many times. "The venue and the catering need to be settled by noon today," he continued. "The total is $65,000. I told Chloe not to worry, that my mum always has my back. It's just a loan, obviously. Once the Montgomerys clear their audit, they'll pay you back with interest. I just sent the invoice to your email. You can do a wire transfer from your retirement account, right?" "It's urgent, Mum. The venue manager is being a real jerk about it. $65,000. The number hung in the air like a heavy curtain. It was almost exactly what I had left in my supplemental retirement fund. It was my safety net, the money I had set aside so I wouldn't have to ask him for help when my knees finally gave out, or when the roof of this old house started to leak. He was asking for my survival to pay for a party I wasn't good enough to attend." I checked my laptop. The email was there. An attachment from a luxury wedding planner in Bellevue. The logo was embossed, elegant, and the total at the bottom was written in a clean sans serif font that made the debt look almost beautiful. $65,000. For flowers that would wilt in a day. For champagne that people would forget the taste of by morning. For the worthiness of a family that couldn't even pay their own bills. "Mum, you still there?" Tyler asked. I thought back to a rainy Tuesday 20 years ago. Tyler was 12. He had wanted a specific suit for a school gala, a dark charcoal one that cost $300. I didn't have $300. I worked an extra 4 hours every night for a month, shelving books until my back screamed, just to see him walk out that door, feeling like he belonged. I remembered the way he looked at me then, with eyes full of pride, telling me I was the best mum in the world. Where did that boy go? Was he buried under the layers of Chloe's expensive silk and the Montgomerys' hollow prestige? "I'm here, Tyler," I said. I took a sip of the cold coffee. It was disgusting. "I'll look at the invoice." "Great. Thanks, Mum. I knew I could count on you." "I have to go. We're heading to the airport for the honeymoon." "Maui. We'll talk when we get back, okay? Love you." He hung up. The dial tone was a flat, dead sound. "Love you." The words felt like a transaction, a tip left on a table after a meal. I stood in the silence of my Queen Anne kitchen, the grey light of Seattle finally breaking through the clouds. But it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the end of a long, exhausting day. I walked to my living room and sat in the chair that used to be my husband's. The house felt too big. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper the word, unworthy. I looked at the photos on the mantel. Tyler at graduation, Tyler at his first job, Tyler with Chloe at their engagement party, a party where I was tucked into a corner table near the kitchen, out of sight of the important guests. I had smiled then. I had told myself it was just how things were now. I had excused his neglect as ambition. I had excused his coldness as maturity. But $65,000 was not a request for help. It was a demand for a sacrifice. He wanted me to pay for the privilege of being erased. He wanted me to fund the very circle that had excluded me. I opened the email again. The invoice was detailed. $10,000 for floral arrangements. $15,000 for a 5-course plated dinner. $12,000 for a premium open bar. My eyes blurred as I read the line items. These were the prices of his new life. These were the costs of his worthiness. I remembered the smell of the library, the scent of old glue and dust. I remembered the hundreds of thousands of books I had carried over the years, the weight of them in my arms. I had built a life out of quiet, steady labor. I had built a home out of honesty and grit. And my son had turned it all into a currency he could spend on people who looked down on the very hands that had fed him. I went to the closet and pulled out the navy silk dress. I took off the plastic cover. The fabric was soft, expensive, a deep blue like the Puget Sound on a clear day. I had spent weeks finding the right shoes, the right pearl earrings. I had imagined the moment I would see him stand at the altar. I had imagined the look of love in his eyes when he saw his mother in the front row. I threw the dress on the floor. It crumpled into a heap of useless, beautiful silk. I realized then that I was not a person to them. I was a resource. I was a backup plan. I was the silent, invisible foundation that they felt entitled to build their towers upon. But even the strongest foundation can only take so much weight before it begins to crack. I sat at my desk and looked at my bank login, my retirement account. The balance was $68,412. If I paid this bill, I would have $3,000 left. $3,000 for the rest of my life. I thought about Chloe's mother, Evelyn Montgomery. I remembered the way she had looked at my house during the one time she visited. She had tilted her head, a pitying smile on her perfectly Botoxed face, and said, "Oh, it's so charmingly vintage, Martha. It must be so much work to keep up. I bet you're just dying to move into a nice managed condo." She wanted my house. She wanted my son. She wanted my silence. And Tyler was giving it all to her, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I didn't do the transfer. I closed the laptop and walked back to the kitchen. I poured the cold coffee down the sink and watched it swirl away. I realized that for years I had been trying to fit into a story that had no character named Mom. I had been trying to buy my way into a heart that had been sold to the highest bidder. The phone buzzed again. A text from Tyler. "Mum, did you do it? The planner is calling me every 10 minutes. Please hurry. We're about to board." I didn't reply. I went to the garden and stood in the rain. The cold water soaked through my thin sweater, but I didn't care. It felt real. It felt honest. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't cataloguing someone else's story. I was starting to realize that the most important book in the library was the one I had stopped writing years ago, my own. The $65,000 bill was still sitting in my inbox, a ticking clock of his vanity. But as I stood in the Seattle mist, I knew that the price of worthiness was something I could no longer afford to pay. Not because I didn't have the money, but because I had finally found my own value, and it wasn't for sale. I looked up at my house, my craftsman home with its peeling paint and its sturdy bones. It was a house built on love and sacrifice, but it was also a house that had been silent for too long. I went back inside, dried my hair, and picked up the navy silk dress from the floor. I didn't put it back in the closet. I put it in a box to be donated. Someone else could wear it to a wedding where they were actually wanted. The phone rang again. It was a Bellevue number. The wedding planner. "Hello?" I said. "Mrs. Thorne, this is Julian from Lux Events. We're still waiting on the final payment for the Thorne Montgomery wedding. Tyler said you were handling it." I looked at the Space Needle through the window, sharp and clear now as the clouds parted. "Julian," I said, my voice steady, cool, and perfectly articulated. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was not a guest at that wedding. And in my experience, people who aren't invited to the party usually don't pay for the champagne. But Tyler said, "Tyler is a married man now, Julian. I suggest you talk to his new, worthy family about the bill." I hung up. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of neglect. It was the silence of a clean slate. I sat down and started to draft a list of things I wanted to do with my $68,000. None of them involved flowers or five-course meals, or the approval of people who didn't know the weight of a book or the value of a mother's heart. I was Martha Thorne. I was a librarian. I was a widow. And I was finally, for the first time in my life, a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it settles. It finds the cracks in the pavement, the porous gaps in the brickwork, and the hollow spaces in a person's chest. I sat by the window in my living room, watching the droplets race down the glass, blurred streaks of grey against a grey world. The phone was silent now, but it felt like a ticking bomb on the coffee table. I had hung up on Julian, the wedding planner, and in doing so, I had severed a wire I didn't know was holding my entire world together. For 40 years, I was the woman who shelved the books, who organized the chaos, who made sure every story had its proper place. But now, my own history was scattered on the floor, and the spine was broken beyond repair. I looked at my hands again. They were red and chapped from the cold morning air. My mind, unbidden, slipped backward, sliding through the decades like a film reel catching on a jagged tooth. 20 years ago. It was a Tuesday, much like this one, cold and unforgiving. Tyler was 12, a lanky boy with eyes that still looked at me as if I were the sun. He had come home with a flyer for the middle school gala, his face glowing with a desperate, quiet hope. He wanted a charcoal suit, not a hand-me-down from the thrift store on 15th, but a real suit, a $300 suit from the department store downtown. I remembered the weight of my bank balance that night, $14. I didn't tell him no. I never told him no. I took a second job shelving the late-night returns at the University of Washington Library and another 3 hours scrubbing the grease off the vents at a diner near the Ship Canal. I remembered the smell of that diner, rancid oil and cheap detergent, clinging to my skin, a scent I could never quite wash away. I worked until my back felt like a collection of rusted hinges. I worked until my eyes burned from the fluorescent lights and the fine dust of 1,000 old books. And when I finally walked into that store and counted out the crumpled 20s and 10s, I felt like a queen. I remembered the way he looked in that charcoal suit. He stood in this very living room, adjusting his tie in the mirror, his chest puffed out with a newfound dignity. He turned to me, his eyes wet with a child's unfiltered gratitude, and whispered, "Mum, you're the best. One day I'm going to buy you a castle. I'm going to make sure you never have to work again." That boy was a ghost now. He had been replaced by a man who saw my 30 years of labor not as a gift, but as a prerequisite. He had been replaced by a man who thought my retirement fund was just another shelf of books he could burn to keep himself warm. The phone vibrated. A notification flashed. It was an email from Tyler, but the subject line wasn't an apology. It was urgent, wire transfer instructions. I opened it. The audacity of the text made the room feel smaller. "Mum," Julian said there was a misunderstanding. "I don't have time for this. We are literally at the gate for Maui. Chloe is stressed out, and Evelyn, her mother, is already asking questions. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? The Montgomerys expect things to be handled with a certain level of professionalism. You're making me look like a child. Just do the transfer. I'll explain everything when we get back." Please, for once, don't be difficult. Don't be difficult. The words were a slap. I was difficult because I wouldn't bankrupt myself for a party I wasn't worthy to attend. I thought back to the engagement party 6 months ago. The Montgomery estate in Bellevue was a monument to glass and ego. I had worn my best floral dress, the one I had saved for special occasions. When I walked in, Evelyn Montgomery looked at me as if I were a smudge on her pristine marble floor. She didn't introduce me to the guests. She didn't offer me a seat at the main table. Instead, a server had guided me to a small round table, tucked behind a large fern, near the swinging doors of the kitchen. "It's quieter here, Martha," Evelyn had whispered, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We thought you'd be more comfortable away from the hustle. It's a lot of social nuance to navigate, isn't it?" I had sat there for 4 hours, watching my son laugh with men in tailored tuxedos, watching him toast to a future that didn't include the woman who had scrubbed grease for his suit. I had seen him glance toward my table once, a quick, shamed flick of his eyes, before he turned back to Chloe, burying his heritage in a glass of vintage champagne. I had stayed silent then. I had told myself it was for his happiness. I had told myself that a mother's job was to be the bridge, even if the people crossing it never looked down at the stones. But the bridge was collapsing now. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my movements stiff. I looked at the teapot on the stove, the one Tyler had bought me for Christmas 5 years ago, the last gift he had given me that wasn't a request for money. It was a cheap thing, probably bought at a drugstore on his way home, but I had cherished it. I picked it up and threw it into the trash. The sound of the plastic hitting the bin was hollow, unsatisfying. Why did he think I would say yes? Was it because I had always said yes? I had taught him that my love was a bottomless well, and now he was confused that he had finally hit the mud at the bottom. I went to the basement and found the old box of his childhood things. I pulled out the charcoal suit. It was tiny now, a miniature version of the man he had become. The fabric was stiff, the cheap polyester blend scratchy under my fingers. I remembered the blisters on my feet from that diner job. I remembered the way my heart had soared when he said he loved me. I realized with a crushing clarity that I had raised him to be a consumer of my soul. I had been so busy protecting him from the world that I had never taught him how to be a part of mine. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a call from Tyler. I knew he was at the airport. I knew he was probably pacing near the window, looking out at the planes, his face tight with a spoiled rage. I answered it. "Mom! What the hell?" he shouted. His voice was raw, stripped of the polite veneer he usually used. "Julian called me back. He said you refused to pay. He said you told him to talk to the Montgomerys. Do you have any idea what you've done? Evelyn is standing right here. Chloe is in the bathroom crying. This was supposed to be the best day of our lives, and you're ruining it over a stupid bank transfer." "The best day of your life, Tyler," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was steady. It was cold. It was the voice of a librarian telling a rowdy patron to leave. "I wouldn't know. I wasn't there." "Oh, for God's sake, we went over this. It was an intimate ceremony. It wasn't about you, Mum. Why do you always have to make everything about your feelings? The Montgomerys are people of status. They have a reputation to maintain. If this bill isn't paid, it's going to be all over the Seattle social blogs. Chloe will be humiliated. Is that what you want? To humiliate your daughter-in-law on her honeymoon?" "My daughter-in-law," I repeated. "The woman who hasn't spoken a single word to me in 3 months. The woman who looked at my house as if it were a landfill. I don't think she's worried about my opinion, Tyler. She's worried about the optics. And so are you. Mum, just pay the damn bill. I'll pay you back. I swear. Just drain the supplemental account. You don't even need that money right now. You're sitting in a house that's fully paid for. You have your pension. You're being selfish, Martha. You're being incredibly selfish. Selfish. The boy I had carried. The boy I had sheltered. The boy I had worked 3 jobs for. He was calling me selfish because I wanted to keep enough money to buy my own groceries when I turned 80. I looked at the Space Needle through the window, a sharp needle of light piercing the grey sky. Tyler, I said, and the silence on the other end was heavy with his expectation of my surrender. I shelved 100,000 books in my career. I organized the thoughts of geniuses and fools. And you know what the most common theme in every tragedy is? I don't care about books right now, Mum. The theme is hubris, I continued, ignoring him. The belief that you are the center of the universe and that everyone else is just a footnote in your story. You and the Montgomerys think you're worthy. You think wealth is a synonym for character. But worthiness isn't something you buy with a $65,000 catering bill. It's something you earn through loyalty. It's something you earn by showing up for the people who showed up for you. Are you done with the lecture? Because the gate is closing. I was done a long time ago, Tyler. I was done the moment you told me I wouldn't fit the aesthetic of your wedding. I was done the moment you asked me to fund a life that excludes me. I am not paying the bill. Not today. Not when you get back. Never. You're dead to me, he hissed. The venom in his voice was so pure it made my skin crawl. I hope you enjoy your money, Mum. I hope it keeps you warm in that dusty old house when you're all alone. Because you've lost your son. Over $65,000, you've lost your only family. No, Tyler, I said, a single tear finally breaking free and rolling down my cheek, not out of sadness, but out of a profound sense of relief. I lost my son a long time ago. I just didn't realize he'd been replaced by a stranger until the stranger asked for my life savings. Enjoy, Maui. I hope the champagne was worth it. I hung up. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't wait to hear the boarding call in the background. I turned off the phone and placed it face down on the counter. The silence returned to the kitchen, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clean. I looked at the calendar on the wall. I took a red marker, and I didn't just cross out the date. I tore the page off and threw it in the bin. I walked to the living room and sat back in the chair. I felt the physical weight of the memories of that diner, the library, the long nights of shelving. I had spent so many years trying to ensure that Tyler was worthy in the eyes of the world. I had polished him, dressed him, and funded him until he shone. But in my haste to make him look like a masterpiece, I had forgotten to check if the canvas was hollow. And it was. He was a hollow man, filled only with the borrowed prestige of a family that didn't even pay their own catering bills. I looked at the photos on the mantel. I saw the Montgomerys' faces in the background of the engagement photo. Evelyn with her tight surgical smile. Her husband Arthur with his cold, assessing eyes. They were a family of illusions. They were a family that lived on credit and vanity. And Tyler had traded a mother's ironclad devotion for a seat at their crumbling table. I realized then that the worthiness Tyler kept talking about was a debt that could never be settled. If I had paid the $65,000 today, there would have been another bill tomorrow. A down payment for a house in Laurelhurst, a luxury SUV, private school tuition for children who would be taught to be ashamed of their grandmother. I would have drained myself dry, drop by drop, and in the end, I would still be sitting behind the fern at the party, invisible and uninvited. The rain started to lash against the house now, a true Seattle storm. The wind howled through the eaves of my Queen Anne home, shaking the old windows. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I realized I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since the call. I made myself a simple meal, toast with jam and a fresh cup of tea. It wasn't a 5-course plated dinner. It wasn't high-end or cohesive, but it was mine. As I ate, I thought about the wedding. I imagined the moment the Montgomerys would find out the bill was still outstanding. I imagined Julian calling the estate, demanding payment. I imagined the look on Evelyn's face when she realized her offshore audits wouldn't cover the cost of the flowers. I felt a small, dark spark of satisfaction, but it quickly faded into a tired peace. Their drama was no longer my catalogue. Their stories were no longer on my shelves. I was Martha Thorne. I had $68,000. I had a house that smelled like old wood and rain. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't waiting for a boy to come home and tell me I was the son. I was my own son. I was my own anchor. I looked at the navy silk dress in the box by the door. I had spent so much time worrying about the flow and the atmosphere of a world that didn't want me. I had spent so much time trying to be worthy of a son who didn't even know the value of the hands that raised him. I went to the library that afternoon, not to work, but to read. I sat in the grand reading room of the Suzzallo Library, under the high, vaulted ceilings. I breathed in the scent of paper and wisdom. I realized that I had spent my life surrounded by the greatest stories ever told, stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption. And in every one of them, the protagonist only truly finds themselves when they stop playing a supporting role in someone else's delusion. I opened a book of poetry. I read a line about the sea, about how it doesn't apologize for its tide. I smiled. I wasn't an aesthetic. I wasn't a logistical decision. I was a force of nature that had been harnessed for too long. When I walked home through the drizzle, my coat damp and my heart light, I saw a black SUV parked outside my house. My heart skipped a beat. Tyler? Had he come back? Had he skipped his flight? But it wasn't Tyler. A woman stepped out of the car. She was dressed in an expensive trench coat, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the rain. It was Evelyn Montgomery. She looked at my house with that same pitying smile, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes now. Desperation. "Martha," she said, her voice tight and forced. "We need to talk. There seems to have been a technical glitch with the wedding finances. Tyler said you were being a bit emotional this morning. I'm sure we can settle this like civil adults." I stood on my porch, looking down at her. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel unworthy. I looked at the Space Needle behind her, sharp and unyielding. "Evelyn," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "You're right. We should settle this. But you're at the wrong house. My son told me you were the worthy ones. And worthy people always pay their own way, don't they?" I walked inside and closed the door. I locked it. I turned off the porch light. In the silence of my home, I sat down and picked up my pen. I didn't write a check. I didn't write a letter to my son. I wrote a list of places I wanted to see. Paris, Rome, the libraries of London. I had spent my life shelving the travels of others. It was finally time to write my own chapter. The $65,000 was still in the bank, but the debt I had owed to my own misplaced guilt was finally completely paid in full. The silence that followed Evelyn Montgomery's departure was not a peaceful one. It was a vacuum, a hollow, ringing space that felt as though the air had been sucked out of my house, leaving me gasping for something real to hold on to. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the rain beat against the heavy oak door I had just locked. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, but my mind was a cold, quiet library. I realized then that I had spent 40 years organizing the world into Dewey Decimal codes, believing that if everything had a place, then everything would make sense. But there is no code for the betrayal of a child. There is no section in the archives for a son who sells his mother's survival for a seat at a table made of smoke. I walked through the rooms of my home, my footsteps sounding like echoes from a different century. The house felt like a museum of a life that had been systematically dismantled. I looked at the wallpaper in the dining room, a faded floral pattern that Tyler had once helped me pick out when he was 16. He had laughed at my indecision, telling me that whatever I chose would be beautiful because I was the one who chose it. Now those flowers looked like withered eyes, watching me in my isolation. I was a bank to him. I was a resource. I was a logistical error in a high-end aesthetic. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, dead and black. I had turned it off, but I could still feel the phantom vibrations of his rage. I could still hear his voice, that stranger's voice, calling me selfish. Selfish. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. I thought of the grease under my fingernails from the diner. I thought of the dust in my lungs from the library basement. I thought of the thousands of miles I had walked in sensible, cheap shoes so he could drive a car that cost more than my first decade of wages. The irony was a jagged blade. I had built a man who was now using the very tools I gave him to cut me out of his heart. Driven by a restless, gnawing need for clarity, I did something I had never done before. I put on my old raincoat, grabbed my keys, and drove out of Queen Anne. I didn't have a plan, only a destination. I drove toward the shores of Lake Washington, toward the neighborhood where the ceremony had taken place 48 hours ago. I needed to see it. I needed to see the atmosphere that was worth $65,000 of my blood and bone. The estate was a sprawling monument to glass and cedar, tucked behind high, ivy-covered walls. I parked my old Volvo across the street, a dented grey relic in a sea of pristine black pavement. The iron gates were closed, but I could see through the bars. The party was over. The worthy guests were gone. But the remnants were still there, like the bones of a feast left out for the vultures. I got out of the car and stood in the drizzle, looking at the lawn. There were white rose petals scattered across the grass, turning brown and soggy in the Seattle rain. A stack of rented chairs stood under a dripping canopy, their gold-painted frames looking cheap and garish in the daylight. I saw a discarded program lying in a puddle near the gate. I reached through the bars and picked it up. The Thorne Montgomery wedding. The paper was heavy, cream-coloured, with gold leaf edges. Inside there was a list of names, a list of people who fit the flow. I saw the names of senators, developers, socialites. And then I saw the family section. The parents of the bride, Arthur and Evelyn Montgomery. The groom's family, represented by the Montgomery household. My name was nowhere to be found. I wasn't even a footnote. I had been erased from the official record of my son's life as if I had never existed. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited. It was that I had been scrubbed away to make room for the Montgomerys' narrative of effortless, untainted prestige. They wanted a groom who came from nowhere, a man who had sprung fully formed from a world of status, not a boy who was raised in a library by a widow with chapped hands. I stood there, clutching the soggy program, and felt a cold, deep fury settle into my stomach. It wasn't the hot rage of the morning. It was a librarian's fury, the kind you feel when you realize a precious volume has been intentionally defaced. I looked at the estate, at the towering windows that Tyler had boasted about, and I saw the hollow truth of it. This was the castle he had promised me when he was 12. He had bought it, but he had locked me outside the gates. I drove home in a daze, the wipers on my car clicking like a metronome for my grief. But as I passed the University of Washington, a thought flickered in my mind. A librarian's instinct. If the Montgomerys were so wealthy, if they were so worthy, why was their liquid assets frozen for a routine audit? Why was Evelyn Montgomery standing on my porch in the rain, practically begging for $65,000? Audits of that scale don't happen to the stable. They happen to the crumbling. When I got back to my house, I didn't go to bed. I went to my small study and opened my laptop. I spent 40 years researching for people who didn't know how to look beneath the surface. I knew how to navigate the public records, the tax assessments, the litigation archives. I began to look for the name Arthur Montgomery. It took me 4 hours. The deeper I went, the more the aesthetic began to peel away like cheap wallpaper. Arthur Montgomery wasn't a developer. He was a shell. He owned a series of holding companies that were a tangled web of debt and litigation. I found a public notice for a foreclosure on a property in Laurelhurst, the very neighborhood where Tyler and Chloe were planning to buy a house. I found a tax lien from the IRS for nearly $500,000. And then I found the most telling piece of evidence. A lawsuit from a catering company in Oregon filed 6 months ago for a failure to compensate for services rendered. The Montgomerys weren't wealthy. They were grifters. They were a family of ghosts, living in a house of cards, desperately trying to find a new foundation to build upon. And they had found it in my son. They had seen his ambition, his hunger for a world he didn't understand, and they had groomed him to be the next line of credit. The $65,000 wasn't for a snag. It was the only way they could keep the illusion alive for one more day. They were using my retirement fund to pay for the mask they wore, while they looked down on me. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my glasses. The betrayal felt even heavier now. Tyler hadn't just chosen a new family. He had chosen a lie. He had traded the ironclad, grease-stained truth of my life for a hollow, gold-leafed fantasy. And the most heartbreaking part was that he probably didn't even know. Or worse, he did know. And he was so desperate to belong to that fantasy that he was willing to bankrupt his own mother to keep the lie from shattering. I looked at the Space Needle through the window, a sharp, cold silhouette in the night. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy fog that obscured the city. I felt like I was at the bottom of a deep, dark well. The void was absolute. My son was gone, lost to a world of shadows and debt. My house was empty. My bank account was intact, but my heart was a ruin. I thought about the brunch Tyler had mentioned. More your speed. He wanted me to come to a cheap restaurant in a few months after the glitter had settled, so he could pat me on the head and tell me I was still his mum. He wanted to keep me on a leash of guilt and affection while he and Chloe played house in a world they couldn't afford. The phone buzzed. I had turned it back on, a mistake of habit. It was a text from Tyler. "Mum, Evelyn told me what you said. I can't believe you were so cruel to her. She's trying to welcome you into our circle, and you threw her out like a dog. We're in Maui now, but Chloe hasn't stopped crying. The venue is threatening to send the bill to collections. If that happens, our credit is ruined before we even start. Do you really hate me this much? Is $65,000 more important to you than your only son's future? Just send the money. Please, I'm begging you. Don't let the Montgomerys see us like this. Don't let the Montgomerys see us like this." He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his standing in a house of cards. He was worried that the grifters would realize he wasn't as deep a well as they had hoped. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The words were a thick, choking smoke in my throat. I went to the kitchen and stood over the sink, staring at the drain. I remembered a day when Tyler was 8. He had fallen off his bike and scraped his knee to the bone. I had carried him 3 blocks home, my own back aching, and I had cleaned the wound, telling him that it would leave a scar, but he would be stronger for it. He had looked at me with such absolute trust, such pure love. Where was that boy? Was he still in there, buried under the pride and the silk? Or had the Montgomerys systematically erased him, just as they had erased my name from the wedding program? The realization of his utter transformation hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, my knees hitting the linoleum with a dull thud. I cried then. Not a soft, ladylike weeping, but a raw, guttural wail that echoed through the empty house. I cried for the boy who wanted to buy me a castle. I cried for the widow who worked 3 jobs. I cried for the librarian who believed that every story had a fair ending. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. I was at the bottom of the U. I was in the void. The house felt like it was closing in on me. Every book on the shelves, every photograph on the mantel, every memory in the corners was a reminder of a failure I couldn't name. I had given him everything, and in doing so, I had given him the power to destroy me. I had been so busy being his anchor that I never realized he was a ship that wanted to sink. I stayed on the floor for hours, the cold of the linoleum seeping into my bones. I watched the shadows of the trees dance on the ceiling, distorted by the streetlights outside. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I had been erased by my son, insulted by his mother-in-law, and used by a family of frauds. I was a footnote in a tragedy of vanity. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, a new feeling began to stir beneath the grief. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a quiet, cold clarity. I was a librarian. My job was to preserve the truth, to protect the records, to ensure that the facts remained unbowed by the whims of the powerful. The Montgomerys wanted $65,000. They wanted my silence. They wanted my house. But they had underestimated the woman who had spent 40 years in the archives. They had forgotten that a librarian knows where the bodies are buried, because she's the one who filed the reports. I stood up, my joints cracking, my body feeling like it was made of rusted iron. I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. My skin was pale. But the set of my jaw was firm. I wasn't just Martha Thorne, the invisible mother. I was the keeper of the Thorne history, and I was done being a footnote. I looked at the phone. There was a new email, not from Tyler, from Arthur Montgomery. Martha, Evelyn tells me there's been some confusion. We value our relationship with Tyler's family immensely. Let's resolve this quietly. I've scheduled a meeting with our financial advisors in Bellevue tomorrow afternoon. Tyler mentioned you might need some assistance navigating the complexities of your retirement assets. We're happy to help you manage your funds, so this bill can be settled without further stress. We'll pick you up at 2. They wanted to manage my funds. They were coming for the last of my marrow. I looked at the Space Needle, sharp and unyielding in the morning light. I realized then that they weren't coming to pick me up for a meeting. They were coming to see if the foundation had finally cracked. But as I stood in my kitchen, the grey light of Seattle filling the room, I knew that the foundation wasn't made of marble or gold leaf. It was made of 40 years of grit, and it was a lot stronger than they realized. I opened my laptop again. I didn't look at the tax liens this time. I looked at the names of the senators and socialites on the wedding program. I began to cross-reference them with the Montgomerys' litigation history. I found a common thread. A pattern of unpaid debts, broken promises, and social climbing built on the backs of the unsuspecting. The Montgomerys weren't just frauds. They were a plague, and Tyler had brought them to my door. The void was still there, a deep, dark hole in my heart where my son used to be. But the darkness was no longer empty. It was filled with a cold, library quiet purpose. I wasn't going to Maui. I wasn't going to a brunch. I was going to a meeting in Bellevue. And I was bringing the archives with me. I walked to the closet and looked at the box containing the navy silk dress. I didn't feel the urge to throw it away anymore. I pulled it out and looked at the deep, beautiful blue. It was the color of the water that surrounded my city, deep, cold, and capable of drowning those who didn't respect its power. I wasn't going to be the victim in their story. I was going to be the ending they never saw coming. I sat down and began to write. Not a check, not an apology. I began to write a letter to my old friend, Silas Vance. He was a retired accountant who specialized in forensic audits. He had been a regular at the library for 30 years, a man who loved the truth as much as I did. Silas, I wrote, I have a story that needs organizing. It's a tragedy of worthiness and debt, and I think it's time we audited the Montgomery household. I looked out at the Seattle morning, the fog finally lifting to reveal the jagged beauty of the city. The void was still there, but I was no longer falling. I was standing at the edge, looking down, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one holding the light. The morning air in Seattle was a sharp, biting cold that seemed to cut right through the craftsman's old wooden siding. I stood in my kitchen, watching the steam rise from my tea, my eyes fixed on the driveway. I had spent the last few hours of darkness sifting through digital archives, but now, as the grey light finally took hold of the city, I needed a witness. I needed someone who understood the language of numbers as well as I understood the language of books. Silas Vance was that man. He was 75 now, a retired forensic accountant who had spent 30 years coming into the library every Tuesday at 2 o'clock to read the financial journals. We had shared 1,000 quiet conversations over the decades, two people who found comfort in the order of things, he in the ledgers and I in the shelves. When his rusted blue sedan pulled into the driveway at 8 o'clock, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was a solid ground, a bridge being built over the void. Silas stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, a thick leather briefcase clutched in his hand. He looked up at my house, then at me standing on the porch, and he gave a single, solemn nod. He knew. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew the weight of a story that had gone wrong. "Martha," he said as he reached the top step. His voice was like dry leaves, brittle, but clear. "You sounded like a woman who had found a ghost in the stacks when you called last night." "I found a whole cemetery, Silas," I replied, stepping back to let him in. "Please, the kettle is on." We sat at the heavy oak table in my dining room, the very table where I used to help Tyler with his homework, the table where I had sat in silence for 48 hours. Silas didn't ask for a preamble. He simply opened his briefcase and laid out his own laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys with the muscle memory of a man who had spent a lifetime hunting for the truth hidden between the lines. I handed him the soggy wedding program I had picked up from the Lake Washington estate and the printouts of the litigation I had found. "Tyler's new family," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The Montgomerys. They say they are people of status. They say they are worthy." Silas adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the names. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant hum of traffic on 15th Avenue. I watched him work, his brow furrowing as he accessed databases I hadn't even known existed. The silence of the house felt different with Silas there. It wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of a laboratory. Status, Silas finally murmured, a grim smile touching his lips. It's a fascinating word, Martha. In the financial world, status is often just a fancy coat of paint on a crumbling wall. You found the tax liens, didn't you? The IRS doesn't care about aesthetic. They care about the fact that Arthur Montgomery hasn't paid a dime in personal income tax since 2019. Is it as bad as I thought? I asked. Silas turned the laptop toward me. It's worse. They aren't just broke, Martha. They are insolvent. This estate they hosted the wedding at, it's not theirs. It's owned by a corporation in Delaware that Arthur is currently being sued by for mismanagement. They essentially squatted in a corporate asset to stage a fantasy. The offshore audit Tyler mentioned? That's not an audit. It's a freeze order from a bankruptcy court in the Cayman Islands. They are a vacuum, Martha. A black hole that has been consuming the assets of anyone foolish enough to believe their lies. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son hadn't just married into a family of snobs. He had married into a syndicate of failures. And I was the next target. They want $65,000 for the catering and the venue, I said. They told Tyler to ask me for a loan. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. A loan. That's precious. Martha, if you give them that money, you will never see a cent of it again. Not because they don't want to pay you back, but because they have nothing to pay you back with. Every dollar they have is spoken for by 100 different creditors. They aren't looking for a loan. They are looking for a donor. They are looking for a mother who loves her son enough to set herself on fire to keep him warm. I looked at the floral wallpaper, the faded pattern I had once loved. I thought of Tyler on the phone, calling me selfish. I thought of him at the airport, his voice full of a stranger's arrogance. He believed the lie. He wanted the lie so badly that he was willing to see his mother as the villain in his story, just to keep the Montgomerys as the heroes. The realization was a physical pain, a sharp ache in my joints. He wasn't just a victim of their grift. He was an accomplice to his own delusion. They are coming here at 2:00, I told Silas. Evelyn and Arthur. They said they want to manage my funds. They want to help me navigate my retirement assets. Silas's eyes sharpened. They are going for the house, Martha. A craftsman in Queen Anne, fully paid off. To people like the Montgomerys, that's not a home. It's collateral. They want to get their names on the deed or convince you to take out a reverse mortgage that they can skim from. They are desperate, and desperate people are very good at sounding like they are doing you a favor. I stood up and walked to the window. The Space Needle was a needle of cold steel against the clouds. I realized then that my worthiness, the thing Tyler kept talking about, had never been something I lacked. It was something they lacked. I had a life of integrity, of quiet labor, of 40 years of service. I had a home that was bought with honest wages. I had a history that was documented in the library's archives and in the hearts of the people I had helped. I was the one who was worthy. They were the ones who were empty. What do I do, Silas? I asked. I'm just a librarian. Silas stood up and walked over to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch light but firm. You are not just a librarian, Martha. You are a woman who knows how to find anything. You are a woman who knows that information is the only currency that never devalues. We aren't going to give them a check. We are going to give them a mirror. We spent the next 4 hours preparing. Silas showed me how to organize the documents into a tactical sequence. We didn't just have tax liens. We had the names of the other mothers they had defrauded. We had the details of the lawsuit from the caterers in Oregon. We had the evidence of the squatting on the corporate estate. Silas helped me draft a series of questions, questions that were designed to peel back the layers of the aesthetic until the rot was exposed to the light. As we worked, I felt the spark of self-respect that had flickered in the rain start to grow into a steady, cold flame. I looked at the photos on the mantel, and for the first time, I didn't see a son I had lost. I saw a man who had made a choice, and choices have consequences. I wasn't going to be the silent bridge anymore. I was going to be the wall he finally hit. "You need to wear the dress," Silas said suddenly, pointing toward the box near the door. "The wedding dress?" I asked, confused. "The one I wasn't invited to wear?" "The one you bought for yourself," he corrected. "Wear it. Not for them. For you. Show them that you aren't a vintage relic to be managed. Show them that you are the mistress of this house and that your worth is not a logistical decision." I hesitated. Then I nodded. I went upstairs and put on the navy silk dress. It fit perfectly, the fabric cool against my skin. I put on the pearls. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see a widow who was sitting in a house waiting to be alone. I saw a woman who had survived the grease of the diner and the dust of the library. I saw a woman who was armed with the truth. I came back downstairs, and Silas stood up, a look of genuine admiration in his eyes. "Martha Thorne," he said softly, "you look like the ending of a very important book." "I feel like the beginning of one, Silas," I replied. He left at 1:30, leaving his laptop and a folder of documents on the table. "I'll be in my car down the street," he said. "If you need me, just open the front door. But I don't think you will. You've spent 40 years shelving the stories of the world. You know exactly how this one ends." I stood in the center of my living room, the silence of the house now filled with an electric, tactical energy. I looked at the clock. 1:45. At 2 o'clock, the Montgomerys would arrive in their black SUV. They would walk up my porch steps with their pitying smiles and their predatory intent. They would try to manage me. They would try to turn my retirement into their liquid assets. I realized then that Tyler's words, "The Montgomerys are people of status," were the ultimate tragedy. He had confused fame for excellence and wealth for value. He had looked at the gold leaf on the program and hadn't seen the soggy paper beneath it. He had wanted a mother who was an aesthetic, but he had a mother who was a vault. And today, the vault was going to open. I went to the kitchen and made a fresh pot of tea. I set out the cups, the good ones, the ones that had been in my family for generations. I didn't feel the phantom vibrations of the phone anymore. I didn't feel the weight of Tyler's unworthy label. I felt like a librarian who had finally found the missing volume in a long dormant collection. I was ready. As I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, I didn't flinch. I stood by the window and watched Evelyn Montgomery step out of the SUV. She was wearing a different coat today, a cream-coloured wool that probably cost more than my first year of library wages. Arthur was with her, a tall man who carried himself with the stiff, artificial confidence of someone who had never actually earned the room he walked into. They looked like a magazine cover. They looked like the future Tyler wanted. I took a deep breath, smoothing the navy silk over my hips. I felt the weight of the pearls around my neck, a weight down that felt like armor. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could ring the bell. "Martha," Evelyn said, her voice a trill of artificial warmth. She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly as they took in the dress and the set of my jaw. "Oh, you look lovely. Are we going somewhere?" "We are, Evelyn," I said, my voice sounding like the deep, steady tone of the library's bells. "We're going to have a conversation about worthiness. Please, come in." They walked into my home. their eyes immediately scanning the room, assessing the value of the furniture, the state of the paint, the liquid assets of a woman they thought they had already conquered. I guided them to the dining room, to the table where Silas's folders were laid out like a battle plan. "Tyler is so worried about you, Martha," Arthur said, taking a seat without waiting to be asked. "He told us you were having a difficult time with the wedding finances. We understand. It's a lot to process at your age, but Evelyn and I are here to help. We have a team in Bellevue that specializes in this kind of transition." "A transition," I repeated, sitting at the head of the table. "That's an interesting word, Arthur. Transition from what to what?" Evelyn leaned in, her smile tight. "From a house that's too big for you, dear. From assets that are just sitting there, doing nothing. We can help you put that money to work. For Tyler. For Chloe. For the family you're finally a part of." I looked at her, at the surgical precision of her face, and I felt a profound sense of pity. She was a ghost, haunting a life she couldn't afford. She was a grifter who had finally met a woman who knew how to check the records. "I've been doing some research of my own, Evelyn," I said, opening the first folder. "I'm a librarian, you see. I'm very good at finding things that people have tried to shelf in the dark." The room went cold. Arthur's confident posture shifted, just a fraction. Evelyn's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the folder. "I found the tax liens, Arthur," I continued, my voice calm and unwavering. "I found the lawsuit from the caterers in Oregon. I found the freeze order on the liquid assets Tyler mentioned. It seems your snag is actually a collapse, and I'm curious. Does Tyler know? Does my son know that he's married into a family of shadows?" Arthur's face darkened, the artificial confidence replaced by a sharp, desperate rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Martha. You're a library clerk from a dusty suburb. You don't understand the complexities of high-level finance." "I understand a catering bill, Arthur," I said, leaning forward. "And I understand that you're asking a 70-year-old widow to pay for a wedding you couldn't afford. I understand that you're trying to steal my home to pay for your vanity. And I understand that my worthiness is something you will never, ever be able to afford." The silence that followed was absolute. The Space Needle stood outside the window, a sentinel in the grey. I wasn't falling into the void anymore. I was the one holding the mirror, and for the first time in their lives, the Montgomerys were being forced to look at what was left when the aesthetic was stripped away. I was Martha Thorne. I was a librarian, and I was finally, completely worthy of myself. The drive across the Evergreen Point floating bridge toward Bellevue felt like crossing into a different country. Behind me lay Seattle, with its mist-shrouded hills and the honest, peeling paint of my Queen Anne home. Ahead lay a city of glass towers and manicured perfection, a place where wealth was the only dialect spoken, and where people like me were usually meant to be seen, but not heard, if we were seen at all. I sat in the back of the Montgomery's black SUV, my navy silk dress rustling against the leather seat, a sound that felt sharper than the silence inside the car. Arthur was at the wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated the afternoon traffic, while Evelyn sat beside him, her neck rigid, staring straight out the windshield. The air in the car was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the acrid metallic tang of desperation. They had come to my house to manage me, but I had brought them to Bellevue to end the story. I looked out at the grey water of Lake Washington. 25 years ago, I had brought Tyler to these shores for a picnic. We didn't have much, just some ham sandwiches and a thermos of apple juice, but we had spent the entire afternoon building a fortress out of driftwood and rocks. I remembered his small, muddy hands as he piled stones on top of one another, declaring that it was a castle for the Queen of Books. He had promised then that no dragon would ever touch me. Now the boy who built me a castle of driftwood was waiting in a high-end cafe, ready to burn my actual life down so he could keep his seat in a fortress made of debt. We arrived at the cafe, a place called the Gilded Leaf, which was exactly the kind of establishment where the Montgomerys felt they belonged. It was all floor-to-ceiling glass and gold accents, with servers who moved like silent shadows. Tyler was already there, sitting at a corner table with Chloe. They were supposed to be in Maui, but the financial crisis had evidently dragged them back from paradise early. Tyler looked exhausted, his expensive linen shirt wrinkled, his hair uncharacteristically disheveled. Chloe was huddled in her chair, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a designer handbag as if it were a life raft. When they saw me walk in with the Montgomerys, Tyler stood up so quickly, his chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. "Mom," he said, his voice a mix of relief and a jagged, defensive anger. "Thank God. Evelyn said you were coming around. We've been sitting here for 2 hours waiting for the wire confirmation." I didn't sit down immediately. I stood at the edge of the table looking at my son. This was the man I had raised. This was the result of 40 years of library shifts and diner grease. He looked at me not with love, but with the hollow, hungry eyes of a creditor. Chloe didn't even look up. She just stared at the table, her jaw set in a hard, entitled line. "Sit down, Martha," Evelyn said, her voice reclaiming its trill of artificial authority. "Let's get the banking details sorted so these children can get back to their lives." I sat. I placed the folder Silas and I had prepared on the table. It was a simple manila folder, but it felt as heavy as a lead weight. Inside was the mirror. "Tyler," I began, my voice steady, sounding as resonant as a tolling bell in the sterile quiet of the cafe. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about worthiness. You told me I wasn't worthy of your ceremony. You told me the Montgomerys were people of status. You asked for $65,000 to fund an aesthetic that I didn't fit into." Tyler sighed, a sharp, impatient sound. "Mum, we've been over this. It was a logistical decision. Can we just talk about the transfer? The venue manager is threatening to call the police for theft of services. Chloe's father, Arthur, is trying to facilitate things, but we need the liquid capital now." I looked at Arthur, who was leaning back in his chair, trying to project a calm he didn't possess. I looked at Evelyn, whose hand was trembling as she reached for her latte. "I'm not doing the transfer, Tyler," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the jazz music in the background had simply stopped. Tyler's face turned a deep, mottled red. Chloe finally looked up, her eyes wide and full of a sharp, predatory shock. "What?" Tyler hissed, leaning across the table. "Mum, you promised. You said you'd look at the invoice. Are you trying to destroy me? This is $65,000. If you don't pay this, our reputation in this city is finished. Chloe's family. They have a standard to uphold." "A standard," I repeated, opening the folder. "Let's talk about that standard, Tyler. Since you feel I'm too vintage to understand high-level finance, I had an old friend help me organize some records. I wanted to make sure I was being professional about my investment." I pulled out the first document, the IRS tax lien on Arthur Montgomery's personal assets. I slid it across the table toward Tyler. "Arthur hasn't paid income tax in 4 years, Tyler," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "His liquid assets aren't frozen for an audit. They don't exist. They haven't existed for a very long time." Tyler looked at the paper, his eyes darting across the numbers. He looked at Arthur, then back at me. This must be a mistake, a clerical error." "There are no clerical errors in the archives, Tyler," I said. I pulled out the next document, the foreclosure notice for the Laurelhurst property. The house you were planning to buy, the one Evelyn said was a family tradition. It's been in foreclosure since February. The Montgomerys aren't your benefactors, son. They are drowning. And they brought you into the water so they could use your mother as a buoy. Chloe stood up, her face a mask of fury. How dare you? You're a library clerk. You're nothing. You have no right to dig into our private business. Tyler, tell her to stop. Tell her to pay the bill and leave. Sit down, Chloe, I said, not even raising my voice. The authority of 40 years of managing a public space was in that command. She sat, her mouth open in a silent, shocked gasp. I looked back at my son. They squatted in a corporate asset for your wedding, Tyler. The estate by Lake Washington isn't theirs. They are being sued for mismanagement by the holding company in Delaware. The $65,000 isn't a loan. It's the cost of a lie. And you wanted me to pay for it. You wanted me to bankrupt my retirement so you could pretend to be someone you aren't for people who don't exist. Tyler was staring at the folder now as if it were a serpent. He looked at Evelyn, who had turned away, her face hidden behind her perfectly coiffed hair. He looked at Arthur, whose face was a grey, defeated void. The status was gone. The aesthetic had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the debt. "Is this true?" Tyler whispered, looking at Arthur. "Arthur, tell me this is a lie. Tell me she's just being difficult." Arthur didn't say anything. He just stared at his coffee, his shoulders slumped, the artificial confidence finally, completely evaporated. "It's true, Tyler," I said. "And the most tragic part isn't that they are broke. It's that you believed that their lack of money made them more worthy than the mother who worked 3 jobs to put you through school. You thought that because they had the appearance of wealth, they were better than the woman who gave you the foundation to even stand in this room." "Mum, I didn't know," Tyler said, his voice breaking. He looked like the 12-year-old boy in the charcoal suit again, small and lost and desperate to belong. "I just wanted to be part of something big. I wanted to make you proud." "Proud?" I asked, a single, sharp laugh escaping my lips. "You thought I would be proud of a son who hides his mother behind a fern at a party. You thought I would be proud of a man who calls his mother selfish for wanting to survive. You confused prestige for pride, Tyler. And in doing so, you lost the only person who actually owned the room you were standing in." I pulled the invoice from the wedding planner out of my purse, the $65,000 demand. I placed it on top of the pile of tax liens and foreclosure notices. "Here," I said, sliding it toward him. "I'm not paying it. I'm not handling your snag. I am a retired librarian, Tyler. My liquid assets are for my house, my healthcare, and my peace. If you want to fund this fantasy, you find the money, or you tell the world the truth. You tell Julian and the venue manager that the worthy Montgomerys are insolvent. You tell your bride that the castle she wanted is a ruin." "Mum, please," Tyler begged, reaching for my hand. I pulled it away. His touch felt like the same cold, manipulative pressure as Julian's phone calls. "They'll take the house. They'll sue us. Our lives will be ruined before we even start." "Your lives have already started, Tyler," I said. "They started with a betrayal, and they are continuing with a grift. If you want to fix it, you start by being honest. You start by looking at your hands and realizing they aren't meant for champagne flutes they didn't earn. They are meant for work, the same work I did for 40 years. I stood up. I looked at Evelyn and Arthur Montgomery. They didn't look like magazine covers anymore. They looked like ghosts haunting a life that had already passed them by. "You should leave," I told them. "This house, my house in Queen Anne, is no longer a resource for your transitions. My son's debt to your vanity is cancelled, but his debt to the truth is just beginning. I suggest you find a way to pay for the flowers before they rot." I turned to Tyler. "I love the boy you were, Tyler. I love the 12-year-old who wanted to buy me a castle. But I don't know the man sitting in this chair. And until that man learns what worthiness actually looks like, I don't have a place in his story. And he certainly doesn't have a place in mine." I walked away. I didn't look back at the gold accents of the gilded leaf. I didn't look back at Chloe's tears or Arthur's hollow rage. I walked out of the cafe and into the bright, artificial sunlight of Bellevue. The black SUV was still in the parking lot, a monument to a life of credit, but I didn't need it. I walked toward the bus stop. I sat on the bench, my navy silk dress rustling against the cold plastic. I looked across the bridge toward Seattle. The Space Needle was a sharp, honest silver against the clouds. I felt a profound sense of lightness, as if I had shed a skin that had been too tight for decades. I had faced the dragon, and it wasn't a monster. It was just a man in an expensive suit with a frozen bank account. The psychological war was over. I had handed back the invoice. I had refused the guilt. I had purged the lie from my life. And as the bus pulled up, a hum of ordinary working-class reality, I felt a deep, library-quiet joy. I wasn't worthy of their ceremony, and thank God for that. I was worthy of the truth. I got on the bus and sat by the window. I looked at the folder in my lap, the mirror I had held up to them. Silas had been right. Information was the only currency that never devalues. I had $68,000 in the bank. I had a house that belonged only to me. And I had a heart that was finally, after 40 years of shelving the stories of others, starting to beat for itself. I remembered the smell of the library one last time, the dust and the glue. I realized that the reason I loved books was because they always had a climax where the truth had to be faced. Today was my climax. And the ending wasn't a $65,000 party. It was a woman sitting on a bus, heading home to a house that was hers, to a life that was honest, and to a silence that was no longer an echo of neglect, but a song of freedom. The confrontation had been a purging. The Montgomerys were gone. Tyler was left to face the consequences of his choices. And I, Martha Thorne, was finally, for the first time in my life, the only author in the room. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I saw a dozen missed calls from the wedding planner. I saw 100 texts from Tyler. I didn't delete them. I simply selected them all and archived them. They weren't part of my current collection anymore. They were just old volumes in a section I no longer visited. I looked out at the Puget Sound as the bus crossed the bridge. The water was deep, blue, and unyielding. It didn't apologize for its tide, and neither would I. Worthiness wasn't a logistical decision. It was a state of being. And I had never been more worthy than I was at that moment, sitting in a navy silk dress on a public bus, heading back to the mist and the truth of my real life. The bus ride back to Queen Anne felt like a slow, rhythmic debridement of my soul. I sat by the window, watching the city of Bellevue shrink into a cluster of glass and ego in the rearview mirror. As we crossed the bridge, the grey expanse of Lake Washington stretched out beneath us, its surface agitated by the lingering wind. I thought about the $65,000 still sitting in my account. For years, I had guarded that money like a sacred relic, believing it was the final proof of my devotion to Tyler's future. I had seen it as a bridge I was building toward his happiness. But today, I realized it was actually the price of my own ransom. I wasn't paying for a wedding. I was paying to remain a prisoner in a story where I was the only one following the rules. I got off the bus 3 blocks from my house. The rain had turned into a fine, misting drizzle that tasted like salt and cedar. I walked slowly, my navy silk dress damp at the hem, the pearls heavy against my collarbone. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a survivor of a shipwreck who had finally reached the shore and realized she didn't need the cargo to breathe. The craftsman looked different as I approached it. It wasn't just a vintage house in need of management. It was a fortress of truth. Every peeling flake of paint was a mark of a year lived with integrity. Every creak of the porch was a voice that belonged only to me. I went inside and didn't turn on the lights immediately. I sat in the darkness of the living room, listening to the house settle. For the first time in 30 years, the silence wasn't a weight. It was a canvas. I thought about Tyler. I wondered if he was still sitting in the gilded leaf, staring at the wreckage of his worthiness. I wondered if Chloe had stopped crying long enough to realize that her family was a collection of shadows. A part of me, the mother who had scrubbed the grease of the diner vents, wanted to go back. She wanted to reach out, to pay the bill, to fix the snag so her boy wouldn't have to feel the cold bite of reality. But that mother was a ghost now. She had died in the Bellevue Cafe, buried under the weight of a son who called her selfish for wanting to exist. A week passed in a quiet, library-like order. I kept my phone off, tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen. I spent my days in the garden, pruning the roses that had been neglected during the months of the wedding drama. Silas came over twice. We didn't talk much about the Montgomerys. We talked about his grandchildren, about the history of the Puget Sound, and about the sheer, undeniable beauty of a ledger that finally balanced. He told me, over a cup of hot tea, that the wedding planner had filed a lawsuit against the Montgomery estate. He told me that Tyler and Chloe had moved out of their luxury apartment and into a small rental in Renton. The house in Laurelhurst had been a fiction, a carrot dangled by Evelyn to keep Tyler on the hook. The house of cards had collapsed, exactly as Silas had predicted. And Tyler was at the center of the ruins. On the 10th day, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the aggressive, entitled knock of Evelyn Montgomery. It was a hesitant, broken sound. I knew before I opened it who was standing on the porch. I went to the door, my heart steady, my jaw set. Tyler stood there. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. The linen shirt was gone, replaced by an old sweatshirt I remembered from his college days. His eyes were red, shadowed by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He didn't look like a man of status. He looked like a boy who had finally realized that the suit he was wearing didn't have any pockets. "Mom," he said. His voice was cracked, stripped of the Bellevue arrogance. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, the mistress of the Thorn archives, guarding the entrance to my life. "Hello, Tyler." I came to apologize," he said, looking at his shoes. "Everything you said was true. Arthur and Evelyn, they're being investigated for fraud. Chloe's father has been using my name on some of the holding companies. I might be liable for some of it. The wedding planner is suing us." Chloe. She left. She said she couldn't be married to someone who couldn't even provide a basic lifestyle. She went back to her aunt's house in California. I listened to him, and for the first time in his life, I didn't feel the urge to catch him. I didn't feel the phantom ache in my back from the library shelves. I felt a cold, distant pity. "You traded your mother for a basic lifestyle, Tyler. It seems the exchange rate wasn't in your favor." "Mum, please. I have nowhere else to go. They've frozen my personal accounts too, because of the link to Arthur's businesses. I can't even pay the rent on the place in Renton. Can I stay here for a while?" just until I get back on my feet. You always said this was my home too. I looked at him, and I saw the 12-year-old boy, but I also saw the man who had asked me to drain my retirement so he could toast to people who hated the very sight of me. I thought about the brunch I was speed for. I thought about the fern at the engagement party. "No, Tyler," I said. The word was a single clean cut. "This is not your home. This is Martha Thorne's home. It's a house built on 30 years of library shifts and 40 years of honest silence. It is not a resource for your transitions. It is not a safety net for a man who tried to cut the wires while I was standing on them." "You're really going to turn your own son away? After everything?" "You turned me away first, Tyler. You turned me away from your wedding, from your family, and from your heart. You decided I wasn't worthy of the person you wanted to be, and I've decided that you aren't worthy of the peace I've finally found. I'll pay you back. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes." "I don't want your money, Tyler. I have $68,000. I have my pension. I have my house. What I don't have is the energy to be the footnote in another one of your tragedies. You need to find your own worthiness, do you now? Not Chloe's version, not Evelyn's version, and certainly not mine. You need to go out into the rain and learn how to build your own castle out of driftwood. And this time, don't ask your mother to pay for the stones." I closed the door. I didn't lock it with a click of anger. I locked it with the quiet finality of a book being returned to its proper shelf. I stood in the hallway, and I didn't cry. I felt a sense of liberation that was almost dizzying. I had spent my life as an anchor, and I had finally realized that the ship I was holding was one that wanted to sink. By letting go, I wasn't just saving myself. I was giving him the only thing he actually needed, the opportunity to be real. The weeks turned into months. I didn't hear from Tyler again, not directly. Silas told me he had taken a job as a site surveyor for a construction company in Spokane. He was working 12-hour shifts. He was living in a small apartment. He was finally, for the first time in his life, paying his own bills. I hoped, in the quiet corners of my heart, that he was learning the scent of grease and the weight of honest labor. I hoped he was learning that a suit is just fabric, but integrity is the skin beneath it. I sold the navy silk dress. I used the money to buy a first-class ticket to London. I realized that I had spent 40 years shelving the travels of others, and it was finally time to see the libraries of the world for myself. I spent 3 weeks in the British Library, breathing in the scent of centuries of stories. I walked through the ruins of Rome and realized that even the greatest empires fall when they are built on shadows. When I returned to Seattle, the mist was still there, crawling over the Space Needle, but it didn't look like a ghost anymore. It looked like a veil being lifted. I sat in my garden, the roses in full bloom, and I realized that the scar on my heart was not a mark of shame. It was a mark of survival. It was the price I had paid to finally, completely belong to myself. I looked at the Space Needle, sharp and unyielding against the clouds. I realized that my value was never a logistical decision. It was never an aesthetic. It was a steady, quiet light that had been burning in the library stacks and the diner grease all along. I was Martha Thorne. I was a librarian. I was a survivor. And I was finally, for the first time in my 70 years, the only person who got to decide if I was worthy. The silence of my house was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of my own breath, a steady, honest rhythm that didn't owe a $65,000 debt to anyone. I had faced the void, and I had built a bridge out of the truth. The story was finally mine. True healing begins in the quiet wreckage of betrayal. where you finally realize that forgiving yourself for loving the wrong people is the hardest, yet most necessary act of all. For decades, I mistook sacrifice for duty and enabling for devotion, never seeing that by holding up a son who didn't want to stand, I was only teaching him how to lean until I broke. The light I found in the aftermath was not a gift from others, but a flame I had to strike myself in the cold darkness of my own house. I am no longer a footnote or an aesthetic. I am a woman who has reclaimed her narrative from those who tried to erase it. My worthiness was never a debt to be paid. It was a dignity I had to finally acknowledge.